human head arcs through the air, trailing blood. It is June 23rd, 1565, and from the shattered ramparts of Fort St. Elmo, Ottoman soldiers are firing Christian heads from their cannons toward the main fortress across the harbor. The skulls, still bearing flesh, still recognizable as men who prayed and fought and died, sail over the sapphire waters of Grand Harbor, Malta, and crash into the walls of Fort St. Angelo, where the surviving Knights of St. John watch in horror. Among the heads is that of Captain Miranda, a Spanish knight who commanded the final defense. His jaw is broken from the cannon's concussion, his eyes are still open. This is how wars of faith are fought. This is how civilizations clash. This is what happens when two empires, one Christian, one Muslim, decide that a tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea is worth more than the lives of tens of thousands of men. On the Ottoman siege lines, 40,000 soldiers raise their voices in a victory cry that echoes off the honey-colored limestone. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is great. Fort St. Elmo has fallen after 31 days of the most savage fighting the 16th century has witnessed. 1,500 Christian defenders are dead, their bodies mutilated, their fortress reduced to rubble. But the siege is not over. It is only beginning. Across the harbor in Fort St. Angelo, a 70-year-old man watches the heads fall from the sky. Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, warrior, scholar, veteran of a dozen sieges, survivor of Ottoman slavery, wears the black habit of the Knights Hospitaller with an 8-pointed white cross over his heart. His face is weathered bronze, his beard silver, his eyes hard as flint. He does not flinch as Miranda's head strikes the wall and tumbles into the courtyard. Instead, he turns to his captains and speaks in a voice like iron scraping stone. Mustafa Pasha dishonors his dead and our martyrs alike. Tomorrow, we send him our reply. By dawn, the Maltese executioners have beheaded every Ottoman prisoner in the fortress, hundreds of men. The knights load the heads into their own cannons and fire them back across the harbor into the Turkish siege lines. The message is clear. There will be no quarter, no surrender, no mercy. This is the Great Siege of Malta, one of the most ferocious battles in human history. For 4 months in 1565, 700 Knights of St. John and 8,000 soldiers and Maltese civilians will face the greatest military power on earth, the Ottoman Empire of Suleiman the Magnificent, and fight for survival against impossible odds. The stakes could not be higher. If Malta falls, the Ottomans will control the central Mediterranean. Sicily will be next, then Italy, then Rome itself. Christianity in Europe hangs by a thread. But if Malta holds, if this tiny island can withstand the fury of the Ottoman war machine, then the Turkish tide might finally be turned back. 700 knights, 8,000 defenders, against 40,000 of the finest soldiers in the world. The heat is brutal, water is scarce, ammunition is limited, disease stalks the hospitals, and every man, woman, and child knows that when the final assault comes, they will likely die. But they are not running. They are not negotiating. They are loading their cannons and sharpening their swords and preparing to make the Ottomans pay in blood for every single foot of Maltese stone. This is their story. To understand why Malta becomes the crucible of civilizations, we must first understand the men and the organizations locked in this death struggle. Born in 1494 in Toulouse, France, Jean de Valette is 70 years old when the siege begins, an age when most men are long dead or retired from warfare. But Valette is not most men. He joined the Knights Hospitaller at age 20, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the warrior-monk trinity that has defined his order since the Crusades. For 50 years, he has fought the Ottoman Empire across the Mediterranean. He speaks 6 languages fluently, including Turkish and Arabic, learned during a year as a galley slave after being captured by corsairs in 1541. Valette understood the Ottoman mind because he'd suffered at Ottoman hands, explains Dr. Ernol Bradford, historian and author of The Great Siege Malta, 1565. He knew their tactics, their psychology, their strengths and weaknesses. This wasn't abstract strategy for him. It was personal. Valette's body is a map of violence. Sword scars crisscross his arms. An arrow wound in his thigh from the defense of Rhodes in 1522 still pains him in cold weather. His hands are calloused from sword hilts and rope, the hands of a laborer, not a nobleman. But it is his presence that defines him. When Valette enters a room, veterans who have seen 100 battles instinctively straighten. His voice, calm, measured, absolutely certain, cuts through panic like a blade through silk. He is a natural commander, the kind of leader men will follow into fire because they believe he will walk through it with them. He is also ruthless. When the siege begins, he executes suspected spies without trial. He orders civilians, even women and children, to carry stones and ammunition under cannon fire. He will sacrifice Fort St. Elmo and its 1,500 defenders to buy time, knowing they will die to the last man. Valette was not a sentimental man, notes Dr. Anne Brogini, specialist in Knights Hospitaller history. He loved his men, certainly, but he loved Malta more, and Christendom most of all. He would spend lives like coins if it meant saving the island. Around Valette gather the cream of European chivalry. The Knights Hospitaller are drawn from 8 langues, or tongues: France, Provence, Auvergne, Aragon, Castile, Italy, Germany, and England, representing the finest noble warriors of Christendom. Each knight has proven himself in battle. Each has taken solemn vows to fight Islam until death. There is the Chevalier de Robles, Spanish commander of Fort St. Elmo, who will choose death over evacuation. There is the Knight Grand Cross Luigi Broglia, an Italian military engineer whose fortifications will save thousands of lives. There is Oliver Starkey, English secretary to Valette, who will write dispatches even as cannonballs crash through the ceiling. And fighting alongside the knights are the common soldiers and Maltese civilians, men, women, and children who will prove as fierce as any nobleman. Among them is a young Maltese man named Tony Bahada, 24 years old, a stonemason from the village of Birgu. Tony has never been more than 10 miles from his birthplace. He cannot read. He has never held a sword before the Ottomans arrive. But when the call comes to defend his home, he picks up a pike and joins the militia. He will fight for 4 months, will kill 6 men in hand-to-hand combat, will watch his brother die beside him, and will survive to rebuild his shattered island. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan of Sultans. 3,000 miles to the east, in Constantinople, the city that was once Byzantium, the crown jewel of the Ottoman Empire, sits the man who has ordered Malta's destruction. Suleiman I, called the Magnificent by Europeans and the Lawgiver by his own people, is 71 years old in 1565. He has ruled the Ottoman Empire for 45 years, transforming it into the greatest military power on earth. Under Suleiman, Ottoman armies have conquered Belgrade, Budapest, Rhodes, and most of North Africa. Ottoman fleets control the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The empire stretches from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, from Algeria to Persia. 25 million people bow to Suleiman's authority, but there is one thorn in the Sultan's side that will not be removed: the Knights of St. John. The Knights had been harassing Ottoman shipping for decades, explains Professor Roger Crowley, author of Empires of the Sea. They were essentially state-sponsored pirates operating from Malta, raiding Muslim pilgrims, disrupting trade, capturing Ottoman officials. For Suleiman, they were both a strategic problem and a personal humiliation. In 1522, a young Suleiman had conquered Rhodes and driven the knights from their island fortress. He had expected them to fade into history. Instead, they regrouped in Malta, a barren, rock-strewn island the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had given them in 1530, and continued their raids. Now, 4 decades later, Suleiman is old, his health failing, his legacy uncertain. He has suffered setbacks. His favorite wife, Roxolana, is dead. His son and chosen heir, Mustafa, was executed on Suleiman's orders in a succession dispute. His beloved Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was murdered. The Sultan is haunted by mortality and the need to secure one final, decisive victory. Malta will be that victory, or so he believes. Suleiman does not personally command the invasion. He is too old, too tired. Instead, he appoints 2 commanders, Mustafa Pasha and Piale Pasha. Mustafa Pasha is 70 years old, a contemporary of Valette, a veteran of 40 years of Ottoman warfare. He is methodical, experienced, utterly loyal to the Sultan. He commands the land forces, approximately 40,000 infantry, artillery crews, engineers, and janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops. Mustafa is a believer in overwhelming force. He brings massive siege guns, culverins, and basilisks capable of hurling 80-pound stone balls over half a mile. He brings thousands of miners to dig tunnels under Christian fortifications. He brings the best military minds in the Ottoman Empire. But he also brings arrogance. He believes Malta will fall in weeks, perhaps days. The island is tiny, 19 miles long, 9 miles wide, mostly barren rock with limited water. The defenders number barely 9,000 against his 40,000. The outcome seems predetermined. Mustafa made the classic mistake of underestimating a desperate enemy, notes military historian Dr. John Gill Martin. He saw numbers and logistics and assumed victory. He didn't account for faith, fury, and the fact that men defending their homes fight differently than men attacking for conquest. If Mustafa represents Ottoman orthodoxy, then Dragut represents Ottoman terror. Born a Christian in Anatolia, Dragut converted to Islam and became the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean. For 30 years he has raided Christian shipping in coastal towns, capturing thousands of slaves, sinking hundreds of ships, becoming fabulously wealthy, and earning Suleiman's favor. He is 84 years old in 1565, ancient by the standards of the age, but still fierce, still cunning, still hungry for one more victory. Suleiman specifically orders Dragut to join the siege, knowing his experience will be invaluable. Dragut arrives in June with 13 galleys and additional artillery. He immediately recognizes what Mustafa has missed. Fort St. Elmo, though small, commands the approaches to the main harbors. It must be taken first, or the siege will fail. "Take St. Elmo," Dragut tells Mustafa, "and you take Malta." He is right, but Fort St. Elmo will cost the Ottomans far more than either commander imagines. The Great Siege of Malta was not just a battle between religions. It was a clash of military cultures, a test of engineering and endurance, a struggle where morale and willpower mattered as much as gunpowder and steel. Both sides believed God was watching. Both sides were willing to die for that belief. Dr. Victor Malia Milanese, University of Malta. Malta in 1565 is not a prize anyone would covet under normal circumstances. The island is a sun-blasted rock, treeless, nearly waterless, supporting a population of barely 12,000 through subsistence farming and fishing. But geography makes Malta priceless. The island sits exactly in the center of the Mediterranean, 60 miles south of Sicily, 200 miles north of Africa. Control Malta, and you control the shipping lanes between east and west. Control Malta, and you have a base to attack Italy, Spain, or North Africa. When the Knights Hospitaller arrived in 1530, displaced from Rhodes by Suleiman's armies, they transformed Malta into a fortress. The capital, Medina, sits inland on high ground. But the real fortifications surround Grand Harbour on the eastern coast. Fort St. Angelo in Birgu, Fort St. Michael in Senglia, and the smaller Fort St. Elmo on the tip of the Cyberas Peninsula, guarding the harbor entrance. These fortifications are formidable, thick limestone walls, carefully designed bastions, overlapping fields of fire. But they are not complete. The knights have spent 35 years building and rebuilding, but Malta is still vulnerable. Valette knows this, so does Suleiman. On May 18, 1565, Maltese lookouts on the southern coast spot sails on the horizon. By afternoon, the full scope of the disaster becomes clear. 193 Ottoman ships, galleys, transports, supply vessels, carrying 40,000 soldiers, siege artillery, and supplies for months of operations. It is the largest Ottoman amphibious assault in history. Valette watches from the walls of Fort St. Angelo as the armada drops anchor in Marsaxlokk Bay. He has known this day was coming. Spies in Constantinople warned him months ago, but seeing the forest of masts, the endless rows of soldiers disembarking, the glint of steel and silk banners in the Mediterranean sun, he must feel the weight of it settle on his 70-year-old shoulders. He does not show fear. A Grand Master cannot afford fear. Instead, he rides through the streets of Birgu and Sengla, stopping to speak to soldiers and civilians, his voice carrying authority and calm. "They are many," he tells them, "but God is with us. We will fight, we will hold, and we will prevail." Privately, he has already sent desperate messages to Sicily and Spain, begging for reinforcements. But Sicily is 4 days' sail away in good weather, and the Spanish King Philip II is notoriously slow to make decisions. Valette knows he may receive no help for months. He has perhaps 9,000 defenders total, 700 knights, several thousand Spanish and Italian soldiers sent earlier by European monarchs, and the Maltese militia, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen armed with whatever weapons can be found. Against 40,000 Ottoman professionals. The mathematics of death are not in his favor. When the Ottoman army lands, Mustafa Pasha faces a crucial decision: where to attack first. Military logic suggests assaulting Medina, the old capital in the center of the island. Take Medina, and you control the high ground and can dictate terms. But Mustafa needs the harbors. His fleet needs a secure anchorage for resupply from Constantinople. Grand Harbor and Marsamxet Harbor are the best anchorages in the central Mediterranean, deep, sheltered, defensible. But to use Grand Harbor, he must first take the fortifications around it, and to assault Fort St. Angelo and the main defenses, he must first eliminate Fort St. Elmo, which commands the harbor entrance with its guns. Fort St. Elmo is small, an irregular star-shaped fort on the tip of Cyberas Peninsula, garrisoned by perhaps 150 knights and 800 soldiers. Mustafa estimates it will fall in less than a week. Dragut, when he arrives in early June, agrees with the strategic assessment, but warns, "These knights do not surrender. Every stone will cost blood." Mustafa dismisses the warning. A week, perhaps 10 days at most. He orders the assault to begin. The Ottoman bombardment begins on May 24, 1565. 15 siege guns, massive bronze cannons, some weighing over 3 tons, firing 80-pound stone balls, are positioned on high ground overlooking Fort St. Elmo. At dawn, they open fire simultaneously. The sound is apocalyptic. Each gun's discharge is a thunderclap that rattles teeth and stops hearts. The stone balls arc through the air, visible as dark blurs against the blue sky, and crash into St. Elmo's walls with impacts that shake the ground. Inside the fort, the Spanish knight Chevalier de Roble watches the walls crack and crumble. He has commanded fortresses before. He knows the mathematics of siege warfare. The walls are 12 feet thick in places, good limestone construction, but they cannot withstand this level of bombardment indefinitely. He has 150 knights, 800 soldiers, limited ammunition, and no possibility of reinforcement. Across the water in Fort St. Angelo, Valette has made his position clear. St. Elmo must hold as long as possible to buy time for the main defenses. De Robles understands. This is a suicide mission. Every man in St. Elmo understands. They do not waver. The bombardment continues for 4 days, dawn to dusk, pulverizing the walls, filling the fort with dust and smoke, and the screams of wounded men struck by flying stone shrapnel. On May 28th, Mustafa orders the first assault. 4,000 Janissaries and Turkish infantry advance on St. Elmo from 3 sides. They come in waves, each wave carrying scaling ladders, muskets, scimitars, and an absolute conviction that dying in jihad guarantees paradise. The defenders meet them with everything they have. Arquebuses, early muskets, fire from the walls, each shot dropping an Ottoman soldier. Cannons loaded with grape shot, bags of musket balls that turn the guns into giant shotguns, cut swathes through the advancing troops. Greek fire, a medieval napalm of sulfur, niter, and petroleum, is poured from the walls onto men trying to scale ladders. They burn alive, screaming, falling into the moat. But the Ottomans keep coming. A Janissary sergeant named Mehmet Ağa, 32 years old, a veteran of the Hungarian campaigns, a believer in the Sultan's cause, reaches the wall with his ladder. He climbs, sword clenched in his teeth, musket balls whining past his head. 2 of his men fall beside him. He keeps climbing. At the top, a Spanish soldier appears, thrusting downward with a pike. Mehmet twists. The pike tears through his shoulder instead of his chest. He ignores the pain and lunges upward, stabbing the Spaniard in the throat. He climbs over the corpse, onto the rampart, and for one glorious moment he is inside Fort St. Elmo. Then a knight in full-plate armor, de Robles himself, appears with a 2-handed sword and nearly cuts Mehmet in half with one massive swing. The Janissary's body tumbles back into the moat. The first assault fails. 200 Ottoman soldiers are dead. The Christians lose 30 men. Mustafa orders another assault the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 3 weeks, the pattern repeats. Bombardment at dawn, assault at midday, withdrawal at dusk, repair at night. The defenders of St. Elmo work through the darkness, rebuilding walls with stones and timbers and the bodies of the dead. Yes, bodies, stacked as barricades, because there is no time to bury them, and every stone matters. Women and old men too elderly to fight ferry ammunition and water from Birgu across the harbor in small boats, running a gauntlet of Ottoman musket fire. One of these water carriers is a Maltese woman named Caterina Vitali, 43 years old, a widow who lost her husband to Corsair raiders 10 years earlier. She cannot fight with a sword, but she can row a boat. Every night, she and 6 other women make the crossing from Birgu to St. Elmo with clay jars of water and bags of gunpowder. On the night of June 7th, Ottoman sharpshooters spot her boat. Musket balls punch through the hull. 1 woman dies instantly, skull shattered. Caterina grabs the oars and rows harder, ignoring the water pouring into the boat, ignoring the bullets zipping past her ears. She beaches the boat on St. Elmo's shore, delivers her cargo, and rows back with 3 women instead of 6. The next night, she does it again. The Maltese were not trained soldiers, explains Professor Franz Chiappara, University of Malta. But they were defending their homes, their families, their faith. That kind of motivation cannot be manufactured. It either exists or it doesn't. In Malta, it existed in abundance. On June 17th, Dragut, the feared Corsair, 84 years old and still personally directing artillery fire, makes a rare mistake. He climbs a hill to observe the bombardment, accompanied by several officers. Christian gunners in Fort St. Angelo, across the harbor, spot the group. One gunner, a German knight named von Staelberg, carefully aims a culverin and fires. The stone ball strikes the rocky hill and shatters, sending razor-sharp fragments flying. One piece strikes Dragut in the head, fracturing his skull. He does not die immediately. He lingers for 6 days, semi-conscious, his brain hemorrhaging on. June 23rd, the day Fort St. Elmo finally falls. Dragut dies without seeing the victory he predicted. His death is a blow to Ottoman morale. He was a legend, a talisman of victory. His loss suggests that perhaps God is not entirely on the Ottoman side. By June 23rd, Fort St. Elmo is unrecognizable. The walls are rubble. The courtyard is a crater filled with bodies. The defenders number perhaps 60 knights and 200 soldiers still able to fight. Ammunition is nearly gone. Water is exhausted. The wounded outnumber the healthy. Valette sends one final message from across the harbor. If you wish to evacuate, boats will be sent tonight. The Knights of St. Elmo send back their answer in writing. We shall stay and fight. Send us no boats. We will not abandon our post. Chevalier de Robles adds a personal note to Valette. We have done all that honor requires. Now we will do what faith demands. On June the 23rd at dawn, 10,000 Ottoman soldiers assault from all sides simultaneously. The bombardment has created breaches in every wall. There is no defensive line to hold, only piles of rubble to die on. The defenders fight with swords, pikes, stones, their bare hands. De Robles, wearing full armor despite the brutal heat, stands at the main breach and kills 7 men before an Ottoman scimitar finds the gap between his breastplate and helmet, nearly decapitating him. Tony Bahada's younger brother, Paulu, 17 years old, fights with a pike until it breaks, then swings the wooden shaft like a club, then picks up a rock and throws it, then charges barehanded at a janissary and is cut down, dying instantly. Mehmet Ağa, recovered from his shoulder wound, finally enters St. Elmo in the second wave. He plants the Ottoman banner on the rubble that was once the main bastion and screams in triumph. By midday, it is over. Every Christian defender is dead. 1,500 men killed over 31 days of the most savage fighting the age has witnessed. Ottoman casualties, 8,000 dead, another 4,000 seriously wounded. Mustafa had predicted a week. It took 31 days. He has lost a quarter of his army taking a fort he thought would fall in hours. And the main fortifications, Fort St. Angelo, Fort St. Michael, the walls of Birgu and Senglea, still stand untouched across the harbor. Fort St. Elmo's defense bought the Christians invaluable time. Every day the Ottomans spent battering St. Elmo was a day the defenders could strengthen the main fortifications, bring in supplies, and prepare for the real siege. But more than that, St. Elmo proved the knights would not surrender. It set the psychological tone for the entire siege. No quarter, no compromise, fight to the last man. Dr. Stephen Spiteri, Fortress Historian. If you appreciate stories like this, tales of impossible courage against overwhelming odds, battles where faith and fury collide, moments when a handful of determined souls change the course of history, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you the past, not as dusty dates and forgotten names, but as the living, breathing, terrifying reality it was for the people who lived it. Every week, we explore the battles, the sieges, the desperate last stands that forged our modern world. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we walk through the fire of history together. Because these stories matter. These sacrifices matter. And they deserve to be remembered. With Fort St. Elmo captured at such horrific cost, Mustafa Pasha must reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The knights will not break easily. But he has come too far, spent too much blood to retreat. The Sultan expects victory. Failure means disgrace, possibly execution. On June the 24th, Mustafa turns his siege guns toward the main prize, the fortified towns of Birgu and Senglea, protected by Fort St. Angelo and Fort St. Michael. If the bombardment of St. Elmo was hell, what follows is a descent into deeper circles. July 1565 in Malta is brutal. Temperatures soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun beats down on the limestone like a hammer on an anvil. Men fighting in armor suffer from heat stroke. Water is strictly rationed. And into this furnace, Mustafa pours fire. He positions his siege guns, now including the artillery formerly used against St. Elmo, on the high ground surrounding Birgu and Senglea. 64 heavy guns, firing from dawn to dusk, day after day after day. The bombardment is systematic. Mustafa's engineers identify weak points in the fortifications and concentrate fire there. A bastion on the Birgu walls. A ravelin protecting Fort St. Michael, the base of a tower. The guns hammer each target until the stone cracks, crumbles, collapses. Inside Birgu, civilian life becomes impossible. Homes are destroyed. Churches are hit, including the Hospital of the Knights, killing wounded men in their beds. Food stores are obliterated. Water cisterns are cracked, precious water seeping into the ground. The noise is constant, maddening. The crash of incoming cannonballs, the roar of collapsing buildings, the screams of the wounded. Sleep becomes impossible. Sanity becomes a luxury. Tony Bashada, the stonemason, is now part of the repair crews. Every night, he and hundreds of other Maltese work through the darkness, rebuilding walls that will be destroyed again the next day. It is Sisyphean labor, futile, exhausting, necessary. On the night of July 15th, working by torchlight to shore up a collapsed bastion, Tony sees a woman carrying stones that must weigh 40 pounds each. She is elderly, perhaps 60, her hands bleeding from the rough limestone. She does not stop, does not complain, just carries stone after stone from the rubble pile to the wall, one trip after another. "Grandmother," Tony says, "you should rest. This work is for younger people." She looks at him with eyes like stone themselves. "My grandson died at St. Elmo. My son-in-law died yesterday in the hospital. If I do not carry these stones, I have nothing left but grief. I will carry stones until I die, or the Turks leave." She picks up another stone and walks toward the wall. Tony picks up his own load and follows. Mustafa decides the time has come for a decisive blow. His bombardment has created breaches in multiple locations. His troops, despite heavy casualties, still outnumber the Christians 3-1. One massive, coordinated assault should overwhelm the defenses. He plans a three-pronged attack. Simultaneous assaults on Senglea, from land and sea, plus an assault on Birgu's walls, timed to spread the defenders too thin to respond. July 15th dawns hot and cloudless. The bombardment intensifies to a crescendo, all 64 guns firing as fast as they can be reloaded. The air fills with smoke and dust and the smell of gunpowder. Then, at noon, the assault begins. From the north, 8,000 Ottoman soldiers advance on Senglea's walls. They carry scaling ladders, muskets, grenades, clay pots filled with gunpowder and nails. Their battle cry echoes across the harbor, "Allahu Akbar!" From the south, a floating bridge of boats allows 4,000 more soldiers to attack Senglea from the sea. Simultaneously, 6,000 attack the landward walls of Birgu. 18,000 men attacking simultaneously, trying to overwhelm 9,000 defenders spread across 2 fortified towns. At Senglea, the fighting immediately becomes hand-to-hand. Ottoman soldiers reach the breaches and pour through. Knights in full armor meet them with two-handed swords. The clash sounds like a blacksmith's shop, steel on steel, screaming metal, sparks flying. A knight named Fra Roberto del Monte, Italian, 38 years old, a veteran of sea battles against corsairs, stands at the main breach with 5 other knights. They form a living wall, shoulder to shoulder, their armor making them nearly invulnerable to slashing attacks. The Ottomans come in waves. Roberto's two-handed sword rises and falls, cutting through limbs and torsos with mechanical efficiency. His armor dents under hammer blows. He feels ribs crack from the impacts. He does not retreat. Beside him, a younger knight, a Frenchman named Louis de Vallier, 24 years old, on his first campaign, takes a musket ball in the faceplate. The ball doesn't penetrate, but the impact snaps his neck. He drops instantly, dead before he hits the ground. Roberto steps over his body and keeps fighting. On the floating bridge attacking Sengler from the sea, Ottoman soldiers crowd forward, eager to be first into the town, first to claim glory and plunder. The Christians have prepared a surprise. Underwater, Maltese swimmers have been working for days, positioning a chain across the approach. At the critical moment, they pull the chain taut. The leading boats in the bridge crash into it and overturn, spilling hundreds of soldiers into the harbor. Many are wearing armor. They sink like stones, drowning in seconds. The boats behind crash into the overturned vessels. The floating bridge becomes a floating catastrophe. Christian cannon firing from Fort St. Angelo rake the tangled boats with grape shot. Musketeer fire from the walls picks off survivors trying to swim. The water of Grand Harbor turns red. Nearly 1,000 Ottoman soldiers drown or are killed in the water. At Birgu, Valette himself, 70 years old, but still stronger than most men half his age, dons full armor and takes his position on the walls. He does not command from safety. He fights with his soldiers, sword in hand, his presence inspiring men to hold when every instinct screams to flee. An Ottoman soldier, climbing a ladder, reaches the rampart and faces the Grand Master. The man's eyes widen. He recognizes the white cross, the distinctive armor of the leader of the knights. He swings his scimitar at Valette's head. Valette parries, ripostes, and runs the man through in 2 economical movements. The body falls backward off the ladder. "Hold the wall!" Valette's voice cuts through the chaos. "For Christ and St. John, hold!" The defenders hold. For 6 hours the battle rages. 6 hours of killing at arm's length, of shoving bodies off walls, of reloading arquebuses with fingers slippery with blood, of fighting until muscles scream and lungs burn, and the world narrows to the next enemy, the next sword thrust, the next second of survival. By evening, the Ottoman assault falters. The floating bridge is destroyed. The breaches are still held by Christian defenders standing on piles of Ottoman dead. The attacks on Birgu's walls have been repulsed with massive casualties. Mustafa sounds the retreat. The Ottomans have lost 2,500 dead, another 1,000 drowned, and at least 3,000 wounded. It is the worst single-day loss of the siege. Christian casualties are lighter, perhaps 300 dead, 800 wounded, but for a force of only 9,000, those losses are devastating. There are no reinforcements. Every dead knight, every killed soldier, every wounded Maltese civilian weakens the defense. And the siege is only half over. August brings no relief. The bombardment continues. Supplies dwindle. Disease spreads through the overcrowded fortifications. Dysentery, typhus, infected wounds. The hospitals overflow. Surgeons work 20-hour days, amputating shattered limbs, digging out musket balls, watching men die from wounds that would be survivable if only there were enough clean water, enough bandages, enough medicine. Caterina Vitale, the water carrier, works in the main hospital in Birgu. She holds men's hands as they die. She cleans wounds with precious water. She writes letters for illiterate soldiers who want to send final words to families they will never see again. On August the 12th, a cannonball crashes through the hospital roof and kills 6 men in their beds. Caterina, standing 3 feet away, is untouched. She looks at the bodies, at the blood soaking into the already stained floor, and she does not cry. She has no tears left. She picks up a bucket and begins cleaning, because there are still living men who need care. The civilians suffered as much as the soldiers, notes Dr. Brogini. Malta had no separation between military and civilian zones. Everyone was in the firing line. Women, children, the elderly, all were targets, all participated in the defense. This was total war, centuries before the term was invented. Mustafa makes one more attempt at a decisive breakthrough. On August 7th, he launches simultaneous assaults on both Birgu and Sanglia, hoping to catch the exhausted defenders unable to respond. The attacks initially succeed. Ottoman troops capture the town of Sanglia itself, pouring through breaches and overwhelming the outer defenses. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seems the siege is over. But Valette has one card left to play. He orders a sortie, a desperate counterattack from Medina, the old capital inland. A small force of cavalry, perhaps 200 horsemen, charges out of Medina and attacks the Ottoman siege camp from behind. The attack is militarily insignificant. 200 cavalry cannot threaten an army of 40,000. But Mustafa panics. He fears the cavalry might be the vanguard of a relief force from Sicily. He orders the assault troops to withdraw and defend the camp. The Ottoman soldiers inside Sanglia, hearing the retreat, abandon their positions and fall back. The Christians retake Sanglia in an hour. The siege has reached its crisis. Mustafa's attacks have failed. His casualties are staggering, perhaps 20,000 dead and wounded out of an original 40,000. Disease is spreading through his camp. Supplies are running low. And still the Christians hold. On September 6th, 1565, 3 months and 19 days after the siege began, Maltese lookouts spot ships approaching from the north. The question that decides Malta's fate: are they Ottoman reinforcements or Christian relief? For agonizing hours, the identity remains unclear. The ships are still too distant. Both sides hold their breath. Then the flags become visible. The cross of Spain, the banner of Sicily. Relief has arrived. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy of Sicily, has finally assembled a relief force. 8,000 fresh troops loaded onto galleys, sailing for Malta. It is not a huge force, smaller than Mustafa's remaining army, but it is enough to shift the balance. The relief force lands at Melieja Bay in the north of Malta. The Spanish tercios, elite infantry formations, march inland, banners flying, drums beating. Mustafa faces the nightmare scenario. Fresh enemy troops at his back, battered but unbroken defenders in front, his own army exhausted and demoralized. He makes the only rational decision: retreat. On September 8th, the Feast of the Nativity of Mary, a date Christians will remember as providential, the Ottoman army begins abandoning the siege lines. They leave behind their heavy siege guns, too cumbersome to transport quickly. They abandon equipment, supplies, even some of their wounded. The retreat is panicked, disorganized. Some units fight rearguard actions against pursuing Spanish forces. Most just flee to the coast and their waiting ships. From the walls of Birgu, the defenders watch in exhausted disbelief. For 4 months, they have faced death daily. They have buried friends, comrades, family members. They have fought until their hands could barely grip their weapons. They have endured bombardment, assault, starvation, disease, and heat. And now, suddenly, impossibly, the enemy is running. Tony Bahadur stands on the wall, still holding a pike he no longer has the strength to lift, and watches the Ottoman banners disappear toward the coast. He does not cheer. He does not cry. He just stands, swaying slightly, unable to process that he might actually survive. Beside him, the elderly woman who carried stones during the rebuilding, the grandmother who lost her family, sinks to her knees and begins praying the rosary, her voice barely a whisper. In Fort St. Angelo, Grand Master Valette removes his armor for the first time in days. His body is covered in bruises, purple and black, where cannonball fragments struck his armor without penetrating. He is 70 years old. He has not slept more than 3 hours in a row for 4 months. He has lost weight he could not afford to lose. His secretary, Oliver Starkey, offers congratulations on the victory. Valette shakes his head slowly. We have survived. That is not the same as victory. Victory would have meant the enemy never came. What we have achieved is survival through suffering. We are alive because men better than us chose to die. He walks to the window and looks across the harbor to the ruins of Fort St. Elmo, where 1,500 men perished to buy him time. Tomorrow, he says, we begin rebuilding, and we will build such fortifications that no enemy will dare test us again. The Ottoman fleet departs Malta on September the 13th, carrying the remnants of a once great army. Of the approximately 40,000 soldiers who landed in May, fewer than 15,000 are combat effective enough to board the ships. 25,000 are dead or too wounded to travel. It is one of the worst military disasters in Ottoman history. The ships sail east, back to Constantinople, carrying the wounded and the defeated. Mustafa Pasha expects execution. Suleiman has killed commanders for lesser failures. But the Sultan, old and tired himself, merely removes Mustafa from command. Perhaps he recognizes that the failure was not tactical but logistical. Malta was simply too far, too well defended, and too fanatically held to be taken by siege. Suleiman himself will die the following year, 1566, during a campaign in Hungary. His death marks the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. The empire will persist for another 300 years, but it will never again seriously threaten Western Europe. Malta's casualties are equally devastating in relative terms. Of the 9,000 defenders, approximately 2,500 are dead, another 3,000 seriously wounded. Civilian casualties bring the total dead to nearly 4,000, 1/3 of Malta's entire population. Nearly every family on the island has lost someone. Every town has rubble where buildings stood. The landscape is pocked with graves, burnt-out ruins, and the massive stone cannonballs that will remain embedded in Malta's soil for centuries. But Malta has survived, and in surviving, has preserved Christian control of the Mediterranean. True to his word, Valette begins rebuilding immediately, but he goes far beyond mere repairs. On March 28, 1566, 6 months after the siege ends, Valette lays the foundation stone for a new city on the Ceberras Peninsula, where Fort St. Elmo stood. The city will be called Valletta in his honor. Valletta is designed as the ultimate fortified city. The finest military engineers in Europe contribute designs. The walls are massive, up to 40 feet thick in places. The bastions are scientifically designed for overlapping fields of fire. The streets are laid out in a grid, allowing cannons to fire down the length of the avenues. Valletta was designed to ensure Malta would never again come so close to falling, explains Dr. Spiteri. It's a city built from trauma, from the memory of 4 months when annihilation seemed inevitable. Every stone was placed with the memory of the siege. Valette oversees construction for 2 years, pushing the project forward with the same iron will that held Malta during the siege. On August the 21st, 1568, at age 74, he suffers a stroke while inspecting fortifications. He dies within hours. He is buried in the Cathedral of St. John in Valletta, the city that bears his name. His tomb's inscription reads, "Here lies Valette, worthy of eternal honor. He who was once the scourge of Africa and Asia and the shield of Europe, whence he expelled the barbarians by his holy arms, is the first to be buried in this beloved city, whose founder he was." Tony Bahada, the stonemason, survives the siege and lives until 1601. He works on the construction of Valletta, building walls that he hopes will protect his grandchildren from the horrors he witnessed. He never speaks of the siege to his family. Some wounds are too deep for words, but in his workshop he keeps a broken pike, the weapon he carried during those 4 terrible months. Caterina Vitale, the water carrier and hospital worker, lives until 1578. She never remarries. She spends her final years working in the Hospital of the Knights, caring for sick children. She is buried in the chapel of the hospital, her grave marker reading simply, "She served." News of Malta's survival electrifies Christian Europe. Church bells ring from Spain to Poland. The Pope declares a day of thanksgiving. Valette and the knights are celebrated as heroes who stopped the Islamic tide. The psychological impact is profound. For decades, the Ottoman Empire has seemed unstoppable. But Malta proves that determined defenders, well fortified and willing to fight to the last, can resist even the greatest military power on earth. 6 years later, in 1571, a combined Christian fleet defeats the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto, the first major naval defeat the Ottomans suffer. Historians debate whether Lepanto would have been possible without Malta's example to inspire European cooperation. Malta and Lepanto together mark the high watermark of Ottoman expansion, notes Professor Crowley. After 1571, the Ottomans never again seriously threatened to conquer Europe. The momentum shifts. It's a slow shift, taking centuries to play out, but the direction is set. Malta was the beginning of that turn. The Knights Hospitaller remain in Malta for another 233 years, until Napoleon evicts them in 1798. But their finest hour, their moment of immortal glory, is forever the Great Siege of 1565. The Great Siege of Malta represents one of those rare moments when the actions of a few thousand people genuinely altered the course of world history. If Malta had fallen, the strategic balance in the Mediterranean would have shifted decisively toward the Ottomans. Sicily would have been next, then potentially Italy itself. The entire Renaissance might have been strangled in its cradle. We live in a world shaped by Malta's resistance. Dr. Bradford, The Great Siege, Malta, 1565. Walk through Valletta today, through the grid-patterned streets and golden limestone buildings, and you walk through memory made solid. The walls still stand, massive, silent, enduring. The bastions still overlook the harbor where Ottoman ships once crowded. Fort St. Angelo, restored and preserved, still guards the entrance to Grand Harbor. But the men who fought and died here are dust. The cannon smoke has long since cleared. The blood has washed away with 4.5 centuries of rain. The screams have faded into silence. What remains are stones and stories and the question that echoes across the centuries: what did it mean? The Great Siege was, on its surface, a religious war. Christians versus Muslims, cross versus crescent, competing visions of divine will locked in mortal combat. Both sides believed absolutely in their cause. The Knights of St. John fought for Christ and the Virgin Mary. The Ottoman soldiers fought for Allah and the expansion of the House of Islam. Both sides saw the battle in apocalyptic terms, and both sides paid in blood for their beliefs. But beneath the religious rhetoric, the siege teaches us something about faith more broadly. Not just religious faith, but faith in a cause, a community, a set of values worth dying for. The defenders of Malta did not hold because they had superior weapons or tactics. Ottoman engineering and artillery were arguably better. They held because they believed holding was worth dying for. That faith in God, in their order, in their mission, transformed ordinary men into something extraordinary. Faith is force multiplier, suggests military historian Dr. Gül Martin. Not in any mystical sense, but in the very practical sense that soldiers who believe in their cause fight harder, endure more, and refuse to quit when rational calculation says they should. Malta is the proof. But faith alone is not enough. The Ottomans had faith too, and they lost. Malta also teaches us about the power of prepared defenses against even overwhelming offense. The Knights spent 35 years fortifying Malta. They studied fields of fire, built overlapping bastions, stockpiled ammunition, drilled their soldiers in how to defend breaches. When the test came, those preparations paid dividends in blood. Modern militaries still study the Great Siege as an example of defensive warfare done right. The use of Fort St. Elmo as a delaying position, trading space for time. The psychological warfare of Valette's leadership. The integration of civilians into the defense. The refusal to panic during setbacks. These are lessons written in stone and blood, and they remain relevant wherever defenders face superior numbers. But perhaps the deepest lesson of Malta is about sacrifice. 7,000 people died in 4 months on a tiny island our most had never heard of, fighting over strategic interests many did not fully understand. Young men like Paulu Bajada, 17 years old, died with a pike in their hands, defending walls they did not build, for a religion they were born into, against enemies they had never met before. Was it worth it? The question is almost obscene in its reductionism, but it must be asked. If you believe European civilization, with all its achievements and atrocities, its art and science and philosophy and conquest, is a net positive for the world, then yes, Malta was worth it. Without Malta, that civilization might have been stillborn. If you believe the Ottoman Empire represented a valid alternative civilization, which in 1565 was more tolerant of religious minorities than Christian Europe, more advanced in many sciences, more sophisticated in administration, then Malta is a tragedy, a moment when a more enlightened culture was turned back by religious fanaticism. Most likely, the truth is that both civilizations had gifts to offer and crimes to answer for, and Malta decided which would dominate the Mediterranean, not which was morally superior. The young men who died on both sides were not philosophers. They were soldiers doing their duty as they understood it. They deserve our respect regardless of which flag they fought under. The elderly Maltese woman carrying stones through the bombardment, Chevalier de Robles refusing evacuation from Fort St. Elmo, Valette at 70 fighting on the Isi, Walls in full armor, Caterina Vitale rowing through musket fire to deliver water, Mehmet R. climbing the ladder knowing he would probably die. These people, real people, with fears and hopes and families and dreams, faced annihilation and chose to fight instead of flee. That choice, repeated thousands of times across 4 months, is what makes the Great Siege endure in memory. We remember not because Malta was strategically important, though it was, but because human beings demonstrated what courage looks like when death is almost certain. They showed us what people can endure when they must, what sacrifices they will make when the alternative is surrender. In an age that often celebrates irony and cynicism, that views heroic sacrifice with suspicion, Malta reminds us that courage exists, that it matters, that ordinary people, when pushed beyond all reasonable limits, can become extraordinary. The stones of Malta remember, the walls remember, and we, walking through Valletta's streets or reading accounts 4 centuries later, remember too. The sun sets over Grand Harbour, painting the limestone walls gold and amber and rose. The fortifications that Valette built stand eternal against the Mediterranean sky. Tourist boats glide across the same waters that once ran red with blood. In Fort St. Angelo, now a museum, visitors walk through rooms where knights made their last stand. They see the armor, the weapons, the faded battle standards. Most do not linger long. It is all so distant, so foreign to our climate-controlled, internet-connected modern world. But occasionally, rarely, someone will stand before the memorial to the defenders of Fort St. Elmo and truly see it. Truly understand that the 1,500 names carved in stone represent men who walked and breathed and feared death and chose to die anyway. And in that moment of recognition, across the gulf of 459 years, the Great Siege lives again. Not as dates and numbers and strategic analysis, but as it actually was. A desperate human struggle, a collision of faith and fury, a siege where the impossible was accomplished and the course of history turned on the courage of a few thousand souls who refused to surrender. They held the walls, they bought time, they saved Malta. And in saving Malta, they saved more than they knew. The stones remember. And so should we.